There are a lot of reasons I think the brain is our most interesting organ. But one of the things that really hooked me on studying neuroscience was learning about some of the bizarre behavior that the brain can produce. I remember taking a psychology course as an undergraduate student and reading about alien hand syndrome, a condition that can cause someone's hand to act with what seems to be a mind of its own. The resulting behavior can be harmless but annoying. For example, the person tries to button up their shirt and the alien hand might start to unbutton it. Or it can be downright violent. One woman had to tie her hand down while she slept to keep it from choking her in her sleep. When I learned about this condition, it blew my mind. I couldn't believe such unusual behavior could come from the same organ that's responsible for things like small talk and sharing memes. This fascinated me enough with the brain that I went on to get a PhD in neuroscience and eventually devote much of my career to teaching people about the brain. My interest in these types of unusual cases also led me to write a book that focused on all the examples I could find of the strangest behavior to emerge from the brain. And the examples I uncovered through the research for my book were definitely very unusual. Take the condition called clinical lycanthropy. In clinical lycanthropy, people adamantly believe they've turned or can turn into other animals. The word lycanthropy refers specifically to werewolves, but scientists today often use the term clinical lycanthropy to describe people who believe they can turn into any animal. And there have been people with clinical lycanthropy who thought they could transform into wolves, snakes, geese, gerbils, and more. One case report I came across described a 24-year-old man who was convinced he was a cat. Part of the reason he was so confident in this belief is that he claimed his own cat had confirmed it. She had taught him how to communicate with her and other cats, and he ended up spending all of his time with cats, acting like a cat. He even had a crush on a tiger at the local zoo. The fact that a disorder like clinical lycanthropy even exists may come as a surprise to you, but I found other conditions to be much more shocking. For instance, there's a condition called body integrity identity disorder, or BIID, where people have an unshakable sense that one of their limbs doesn't belong on their body. People with BIID can be tortured by the presence of what seems to be an extra limb, and some even turn to extreme measures to correct the situation. One man felt like his legs didn't belong on his body, so he packed them in dry ice for 7 hours until they were severely frostbitten and had to be amputated. Afterward, ironically, he said he felt like a complete person for the first time in his life. Neuroscientists think that both clinical lycanthropy and BIID might begin with a discrepancy between someone's physical body and a virtual map of the body that's created in the brain to maintain awareness of your body's position and where it is in space. In both disorders, the patient's body doesn't feel right to them, and those abnormal bodily perceptions combine with other brain disruptions, which leads to different interpretations and behaviors in each disorder. Now, as unusual as these conditions might sound, they're just a couple of examples of the many bizarre neurological disorders that can affect people. But these are rare conditions, and so I imagine most of you would assume that the people who experience them would have brains that are very different from yours and mine. Honestly, that's what I expected to find when I began researching these types of disorders. But instead, what I was impressed by is that the brains of people with conditions like clinical lycanthropy or BIID are more similar to a quote-unquote healthy brain than they are different. In fact, some of the cases I came across had completely typical brains and behavior until an unexpected event, like a stroke, traumatic brain injury, or a brain tumor, disrupted a bit of neurocircuitry, drastically altering the individual's perceptions and cognitive functions in the process, and sometimes making their behavior resemble something they never would have imagined exhibiting before. Of course, we're all susceptible to strokes, traumatic brain injuries, and brain tumors. Our brains are amazing organic machines, but they're also highly vulnerable. And so as I was writing about some of these individuals, I felt like I had more in common with them than I expected to. The only thing that makes me different is I've been fortunate enough to not have experienced a life-altering neurological event. Nevertheless, all of our brains are very fragile, which makes the everyday reality that we come to take for granted frighteningly tenuous, and which makes the separation between a typical brain and the brain of someone with a rare disorder smaller than you might expect. But even those of us who won't be affected by a major neurological event like a stroke will still face the gradual declines in brain function that happen as we age. So even if you feel like your brain is working the way you want it to now, the fact is that it won't work that well forever. But of course, there's not many among us who can say our brains are working exactly the way we want them to. Something else I learned from studying unusual human behavior is that all human brains, whether we're talking about the brains of people with rare disorders or just the brains of anyone in this room, all human brains are exceedingly strange and unpredictable. And so you don't have to look at the strangest of the strange, like I did, to find brains that cause people to think and act in ways they don't anticipate or desire, because all of our brains do that. When this happens excessively, we often consider it a disorder, like obsessive-compulsive disorder, addiction, depression, and so on. Now, in the past, we used to look at these types of disorders in black and white terms. Either you had one or you didn't. And using that approach, we could put people into distinct categories using clear diagnostic criteria. And any thoughts and behaviors that align with the symptoms of one of these disorders, we would consider to be abnormal and potentially unhealthy. But today, we're experiencing a paradigm shift in this black and white view of human behavior. We're shifting from an all-or-nothing mindset to one that recognizes there's a wide spectrum of human tendencies. If you take any one behavior, for example, then at one end of that spectrum, you might see an excess of that behavior, which could cause a great deal of distress and lead to a diagnosis with a particular disorder. At the other end of that spectrum, however, you might see an absence of that behavior, which could also be problematic. It might warrant a diagnosis of its own. But someone in the middle of that spectrum isn't free of so-called abnormal tendencies. We all display them now and then, sometimes with a good amount of frequency. Let's take the symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, as an example. OCD is a condition that's characterized by obsessive thoughts, or thoughts that you just can't get out of your head even though you don't want them there. These thoughts are typically linked to compulsions, or behaviors that someone feels compelled to engage in, usually to reduce the anxiety and discomfort caused by their obsessive thoughts. In the research for my most recent book, I came across the case of a 14-year-old girl, let's just call her Amy, who had an especially severe case of OCD. Amy was obsessed with the thought she might become infected with pinworms. Now, if you're not familiar with pinworms, you're probably better off. They are tiny white worms whose eggs hatch in your intestines. Then the female worms wait until you're asleep and crawl out through your anus to lay their eggs around your anus while you're sleeping. Yeah, I know. Scientists, by the way, still don't even understand how these worms know when you're asleep, which for some reason makes the whole situation that much creepier. But the eggs cause severe itchiness, and itching is typically how the eggs get dislodged and spread. Then infection occurs when someone unintentionally ingests or inhales these microscopic eggs. Amy couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that she might become infected with pinworms, and after I learned the details of how they spread infection, I had a hard time blaming her. But Amy's focus on pinworms started to get excessive. She eventually became afraid to open her mouth for fear it would lead to her ingesting pinworm eggs, and this prompted a 10-month spell where she essentially didn't speak. Then she stopped eating and ultimately had to be hospitalized. So Amy represents the extreme end of a spectrum when it comes to OCD, but of course there are less severe cases of OCD, and because this is a spectrum or a range of behavior, there are even people who exhibit OCD-like symptoms sometimes, just not enough to be diagnosed with the disorder. In fact, I imagine everyone in this room has had obsessive thoughts and even displayed compulsive behavior before. Have you ever, for instance, had a relationship that ended and you didn't want to think about the person, but you couldn't get them out of your head? That's an example of obsessive thinking. And have you ever, to get those obsessive thoughts to go away, called or texted that person, even though you knew it wasn't a good idea? That would be compulsive behavior. Or maybe you had an embarrassing social situation that you kept replaying over and over again in your head, feeling more and more mortified every time you remembered it. That's an obsessive thought. And maybe you felt compelled to indulge in a bad habit, like having a few drinks or eating some comfort food, anything to take your mind off of the situation and to relieve some of the anxiety being caused by your thoughts. Again, that's an example of compulsive behavior. So these are just a handful of examples. Maybe, like me, you've experienced all of those, or maybe you have other examples from your life. The point is that even if you don't have OCD, and to be clear, I'm not saying that anybody who has some OCD-like symptoms has OCD, as I don't want to diminish the seriousness of the disorder by suggesting we all have it to some degree. But even if you don't have OCD, the thought patterns and behaviors that define OCD are similar to thoughts and behaviors you've personally experienced. And so the familiarity of those types of symptoms suggests that their occurrence really may not be abnormal at all. Even if when they occur with more frequency or severity, they still become a major obstacle in people's lives. But OCD-like symptoms represent just one of many spectrums of human tendencies. You could even argue that disorders like clinical lycanthropy and BIID just represent the extreme end of a spectrum that involves misperceptions about our bodies. That spectrum might also include more common problems with how we perceive our bodies, some of which might be diagnosable conditions in their own right, like body dysmorphic disorder, where someone develops an obsessive focus on a perceived flaw in their appearance to the point where their preoccupation substantially interferes with their life. This is something that potentially affects over 2% of the population. But on that spectrum as well might be body image concerns that are experienced by most of us from time to time, just not to the point where they become disruptive enough to be considered a disorder. Because many of us, at some point in our lives, develop a preoccupation with how part of our body looks, and that preoccupation might even be linked to a distorted perception of our body, of how it both looks and feels. And so even though a disorder like clinical lycanthropy sounds very bizarre, maybe you experience a tiny bit of that type of thinking when, due to a distorted body image, you see yourself differently than others see you. And there are a lot of other thoughts and behaviors that many of us experience somewhat regularly, but if they were taken to an extreme, would constitute a disorder. And so there are countless examples of what we would consider healthy people having so-called abnormal thoughts and displaying atypical behavior. Even if you don't have diagnosable depression, for instance, you may have days where you endure crushing feelings of sadness or overwhelming guilt. Even if you don't have an addictive disorder, you may struggle at times with suppressing cravings to do certain things you know aren't in your best interests. Even if you don't have an anxiety disorder, you may occasionally find yourself consumed with worry for no apparent reason. And so something else I learned from studying the strangest cases of human behavior is that our benchmark for deciding what makes a brain abnormal is a normal brain that doesn't actually exist. Our brains are all imperfect, and they're all very strange. And they all cause us to think and do things that, at least from time to time, hinder our happiness and well-being. And yet, many of us are experts at pretending this isn't the case. We become adept at concealing any thought patterns we consider abnormal, keeping them hidden away at all costs. And we try to act like we've always got it all together. We ask each other, "How are you?" And our automatic response is, "Good," even on days when we feel like everything is just crumbling apart in our lives. We cultivate personas that project self-confidence and stability, both in person and online, and we try to filter out the negative from what the world sees of us. In fact, I'm doing it right now. I'm trying to act like I'm confident and secure up here on the stage, even though I'm very preoccupied with what you all are thinking about me. And even though I'm talking about things like symptoms of depression, OCD, anxiety, and so on, I'm stopping short of giving the impression that I actually experience those types of symptoms. And why? Because I worry that if I admit to some of my own mental struggles, I'll be looked at differently, maybe as weak or not as in control as I'd like people to think I am. But the truth is, on any given day, I could be experiencing substantial symptoms of depression, even though on other days I feel fine. I sometimes worry excessively, and I can go through periods where it's hard for me to get anxious thoughts out of my head. I struggle at times to control cravings, and I feel guilty when I give in to them. I could go on, because honestly, my mental ups and downs and eccentricities take up as much of my energy as anything else in my life, including my 2 kids, and that's saying a lot. But I try to cover all this up to make sure my friends, family, coworkers, and even the students I teach don't see it. And yet, even though I've revealed that to all of you, I imagine most of you don't think less of me. Most of you probably aren't criticizing me in your minds. In fact, some of you might be able to relate to me a little bit better. Some of you might be thinking, hey, this guy goes through some of the same stuff I go through, and maybe it helps you feel a little bit better about your own issues to know that others have these types of problems as well, even when it's not obvious on the surface. So, despite my fears, admitting that I deal with these types of mental struggles doesn't make people dislike me or think I'm strange or incompetent. So why do we take such pains to hide what's really going on in our heads? And what if we stopped doing that? What if we allowed some more of our abnormalities and frailties to show? Maybe it would help us to be more compassionate towards each other if we are able to recognize that others have their own mental battles just like us. And maybe it would help us to be more compassionate towards ourselves if we were to stop comparing ourselves to a standard of a normal brain that truly doesn't exist. Thank you.